Welcome to the Atlantean Mysteries. In the last episode, we were introduced to Ezra Lockwood and John Spencer as they were presented with the opportunity to investigate an incident at a chemical innovation company called Naptu Industries. A scientist at Naptu, named Dr. Aurelie Blanchard, had recently suffered minor burns when a previously stable compound had exploded during routine testing. The timing couldn't have been worse, as the team was only days away from presenting this brand new compound for a contract worth millions of dollars. Uncertainty now hangs over the compound and the presentation. Ezra and John are on site in Texas and have met both with the head of innovation, Dr. Vishwakarma, and seen the surveillance footage of the incident. What more will they learn, and can Ezra shed any light on this murky mystery? Find out now on the Atlantean Mysteries. The Incident of the Chemical Reaction. Part 3. For a while we walked in silence, for I was feeling rather impatient with Ezra. His behavior so far had been underwhelming in my estimation. His questions of Dr. Vishwakarma had been not only useless, but impertinent, and then he had insisted on staring at meaningless video of Dr. Blanchard at her desk for 20 minutes. I suppose my annoyance at the time was largely driven by my own lack of confidence and sense of being useless and out of place. I hoped Ezra would have something to say, which would validate our presence at Naptu, yet he said nothing. Eventually, as my own thoughts wandered, and I began looking about the hallway in which we were walking, I found I impulsively voiced a sudden recognition. "Cameras everywhere," pointing to the corners. Ezra nodded. I waited a while longer. Still, he said nothing, so I broke down and asked, "Did you see anything of interest?" "On the video," he asked in return. "Yes, on the video. Where else?" "There's something of interest everywhere I look," he said, being difficult. I waited. "As for the recording, I saw what you saw." "You know you saw more than me." "I'm not so sure, John. I think we saw the same thing. I'm just thinking about what we didn't see because of what we did see, and I don't suppose you're doing that." "No, I'm definitely not thinking about what I didn't see," I retorted. "There was enough with what I did see. Poor woman. That explosion was an awful few moments for her." "Yes, and the moments leading up to it," he said enigmatically, "though I'm not certain which were worse." "What?" I asked, utterly confused. But in that moment we had turned the corner and saw a man near the elevator looking in our direction expectantly. "Ezra Lockwood, John Spencer?" he asked. "Yes," we responded. "Dr. Vishwakarma could not come himself." The man went on. "I'm Dr. Henry Kofi. Just call me Henry. I worked with Dr. Aurelie Blanchard. I'll be able to show you the lab and answer any questions you have." As we shook hands with Henry, I thought, we've been pawned off again. But like James, Henry was at least amiable. When he wasn't speaking, he seemed to be smiling, a real smile that went all the way to his eyes. "Come," Henry said, inviting us back into the elevator. "It's on the bottom floor." As we boarded the elevator, Ezra asked him, "Were you there when they ran the successful test Friday?" "Yes, I was," Henry answered. "It was Mitford, Dr. Mitford that is, I think, that did the mixing testing. It's fairly routine, really, just making sure the components are storing without degradation. We want a good demonstration, you know. Everyone has put so much into this, we don't want something to slip at the final mile." Here was a man who was contagious with happiness. Despite the setback this incident had no doubt been to the team, he was enthusiastic and optimistic. Just being in Henry's company, I immediately felt my own doubts slipping away. "We'll be fine-tuning the catalyzer in the base," Henry was saying as he led us off the elevator and down a wide corridor. "We want optimum stability and ease of application, of course. And part of that is the ratio itself. Well, that'll happen after, though. Right now, it's just about a successful demo. I'm sure we'll be tweaking the formula for months." "You sound very confident," I said, somewhat as a question. "There's nothing wrong with T112. Henry said dismissively. These components don't explode into flames. Even if Dr. Vishwakarma cannot smooth things out and save this demo, we're moving forward. This material, it's amazing. His passion was evident, but I struggled with the reality of what I had just seen in the monitor room. But it did just explode. Yesterday, I said. You've seen the recording, right? His face fell a little for the first time. Yeah, he admitted. That was awful, seeing what Aurelie went through. Every time I think about it, I hear her scream ringing in my head. He was quiet a second, and the sound of our feet on the carpeted floor suddenly seemed very loud. But she's recovering really well, he said eventually. And I've heard the burn is not as serious as we all thought. Another pause, then, but that has nothing to do with T-112. You think this was definitely sabotage then? Ezra asked before I could. Absolutely, Henry said emphatically. And I hope Cyrus gets that guy who did it. Who is Cyrus? I asked. Oh, sorry. Henry apologized. Cyrus Anders is the security director. He's ex-something, military or law enforcement. He's going after that guy. The recruiter from the competitor? Ezra asked. I was glad to hear he had actually been listening. Yeah, Henry answered. Were you approached by him? I asked. I was, Henry said, a twinge of anger and disappointment in his expression. And if I'd have known what he was going to do... He left the sentence unfinished. I was wondering what this friendly, but tall and athletic, Dr. Henry Kofi would have done, when Ezra interrupted my thoughts by asking, what was the recruiter's ask and what was his offer? He didn't get so far as offering me anything, Henry said. I knew what he was about and put him off straight away. We all did. You don't think anyone talked to him? Ezra asked dubiously. No way, Henry countered. No one needing money or anything? Even if they said they didn't talk to him, people lie. Nah, we're family here. We all have been given everything we have to T-112 for like 6 months. No way anyone turns their back on this. So saying, Henry opened the door we had just come to, and we passed into the very office space we had seen from the recording. He was continuing straight ahead, toward the door opposite, which led to the lab itself, but Ezra stopped him, saying, I'd like to see Dr. Blanchard's desk first, please. Puzzled, Henry thought a moment, as if he didn't understand the request. Rayleigh's? He asked, but Ezra was already walking toward the desk, easily identifying it from the recording. We followed him, both of us confused. At the desk, Ezra sat in the chair and looked forward beyond the monitor and through the windows to the lab. Oh, yeah, Henry said, as if he then understood Ezra's intent. She definitely would have been able to see someone if they'd have been out there. Ezra didn't respond to him, but turned his attention to the desk. Aside from the workstation and display, there was a photo in a frame. A close-up of a man and woman in snorkeling gear with big smiles on their faces, and a sea urchin held before them on one of their hands. The woman was Dr. Blanchard. I assumed the man was her husband. They looked very happy. Ezra, meanwhile, was looking in the trash can. And then he was on his hands and knees, peering under the desk, beneath a chair and in the corner. I gave Henry a shrug. I'm not quite clear, Henry said hesitantly. What you two exactly do? I didn't know what to say. I had been questioning our presence there all morning myself. But as Ezra clearly had no intention of answering, I fumbled a moment before saying, Ezra's an experimental archaeologist. I was painfully aware that answer didn't give credence to his current behavior in any way. And I work in media studies and communications and journalism, I said, stacking one pursuit atop another, hoping in combination they would seem more impressive than they really were. Ah, Henry said, clearly not finding the answers helpful. Ezra was now up and moving. Okay, he said. I'm ready to see the lab now. He was at the door and reaching for the handle, but Henry stalled him, saying, You can't just walk in there, it's a clean room. Well, kind of. Crossing the room, he stood near the door, where a small cleaning station was built into the adjacent wall, and he explained further. Take everything out of your pockets and put it in those trays, and then do a hand scrub. It's minimal, but we try to limit the number of uncontrolled substances and signals going in." We followed his directions, Ezra poking around the station as he did so, as one who had lost a piece of jewelry or something, and then we were stepping into the lab. As we did, I asked Henry, "Your team does some pretty sensitive research here, huh?" "Not really," Henry said. "We're not building microchips or working with viruses or anything, but if things are consistent and controlled, it's easier, to make adjustments and run tests." I felt by the change in his tone we were losing respect in his eyes. I guessed he had been told Mr. Hunter had sent us, and so he had assumed we were a couple of intelligent people who might shine some light on this odd situation. But instead, Ezra was checking for coins under the furniture, and I was trying to fill the awkward silence with pointless questions. "I'm sorry for wasting your time, Dr. Kofi," I apologized sincerely. "Mr. Hunter has had experience with Ezra here, helping him out when things looked, unsolvable. He has a different way of seeing things, Ezra, that is. So Mr. Hunter asked if Ezra would have a look. I'm just along for the ride." Henry's face returned to his usual cheerfulness with ease as he said, "Call me Henry, please, Mr. Spencer." "John," I said in turn. "John is fine." "Okay, John," he said. "Well, it's not that I'm busy. We're all just a little curious. A message comes in first thing this morning that Mr. Hunter sent 2 men who are going to look into the accident, and for us to show them everything they want to see. We're a tight group here, you understand? And this work is highly competitive. We can become pretty obsessed with a fear that someone's going to steal our ideas. I guess that makes us overly suspicious." "I understand," I said. I had been following Henry toward the infamous lab bench as we spoke, but Ezra had turned to the left and begun walking the perimeter of the room. "So that's where it happened," Henry said a little louder, as if to draw Ezra's attention. Ezra turned to him and nodded, and then continued his survey of the room. Coming upon a door in the wall opposite from the office, he asked, "This door leads to the loading area?" "Yes, eventually," Henry answered. "There's a hallway with supply closets, long-term storage for tests and such. There's another locked door beyond, and I think another one after that. I never go that way, but that's how the materials and gases are kept in stock." I stood next to a table and looked about. The room was maybe 30 or 40 feet wide, and a little less than that deep. Workstations with computers and lab benches with small equipment and instruments filled the floor space, with shelves and cabinets covering the walls. It was clean, organized, and well lit, and I felt oddly unassuming. "I have to say, I'm a little surprised," I said. "It looks like a high school lab in here. Where's all the big high-tech equipment?" Chuckling, Henry said, "We do final stage tuning here. The live lab is the point of maximum refinement, you might say. Everything begins in Annex, inputting parameters and requirements." "Annex is your private ICE?" I asked. "Yes," he confirmed. "Like most private ICEs, it's pretty limited on the front end, so we have a separate team of computer chemists, more techies and chemists, really. It's slower than the old days, but the results have spoken for themselves. Annex gives us the formulas and runs the simulations. We keep tweaking the output by micro-step adjustments in materials and processes and conditions. Every formula has been extensively vetted before it ever reaches the live lab." I was taken aback by this information. I realized in my mind I absurdly pictured chemical innovation as pouring random things into test tubes and seeing what happened. I didn't share this foolish notion with Henry, however, but asked instead, "So where's the innovation happening if everything is just created by your ICE?" Henry laughed again, saying, "Well, creativity is not just in the result, it's also in the question." He pointed to a plain paper printout someone had stuck to the wall. It said, "It is not our ability to create that separates us from the machine, but our desire." It was one of those quotes that would resurface every now and again from some decades ago, and it set my mind back to my studies in early adoption of AI, and all of the fears around sentience and autonomy. Little did people realize the real problem was information decay. and only through isolation could cognitive engines continue to be a service to humankind. I've seen computers make some amazing things when we ask them to, Henry said, interrupting my musing. But I've never seen one make anything simply because it wanted to. You could program it to want to, but that's still not the same thing. Henry, I guessed, was a few years younger than myself, and I wondered at the difference those few years made. But I supposed also his line of study had not exposed him to the significance of where we would now be if technology had proceeded, as it appeared it would earlier in the century. However, Henry was returning to the topic of their process, saying, "Besides, simulations are never real life. After they've all been run, we do the live tests, hence the live lab. But we don't need much equipment here, since the recipe has been so fine-tuned. But the facility has all the high-tech stuff you're talking about, John. The mass spectrometers and gas chromatographs, nuclear magnetic resonance and X-ray diffractors, and so on. They're just elsewhere. They bring us what we need and we send them what we want tested." At this point, Ezra walked up to us. He was looking around in what seemed to me to be an aimless way, as if he were lost. Puzzled, Henry said, "So this is where Aurelie was when the accident happened." He indicated the lab bench next to him. Everything had been cleaned, so there was no obvious indication of the chemical reaction. But I knew from the video which bench it had been, so there was no doubt Ezra knew as well. He walked around it, and then again began searching the floor on hands and knees, beneath the workstations and chairs. As he did so, he asked, "You ran an analysis on the leftover materials?" "We tried," Henry said. "The lab is still trying, I guess, but between the chemical extinguisher and the water, it's muddled. Actually, most of it went down the drain, I think." "Why do you suppose Dr. Blanchard did that? Ran water on it?" Ezra asked. "I was wondering that," I interjected. "I thought water was risky for chemical fires." Henry shrugged in his own confusion, saying, "I'm not sure why I really did that. I guess she panicked." There was an awkward moment before I asked, "Any possibility of contamination with anything else in the lab? You have more than one project here, I assume." "Nah," Henry said easily. "Nothing here behaves like that, and everything is isolated anyway." "What about corrosion of the holding tank or something left in the beaker?" I pressed. "The CCs, the computer chemists that is, are running simus of corrosion and catalyst breakdown through Annex," he said. "But they're just trying to seem busy. Have you ever rested the rubber sole of your shoe against a stainless steel refrigerator and found it exploded into flames?" "No," I said with a chuckle, "but I never put my feet on the refrigerator either." He laughed. "Yeah, ridiculous example, but my point is that's what it'd be like. This stuff just isn't that volatile." I wasn't sure what to say, so I asked what I already knew, but what seemed so unbelievable. "And they retested the compound again, and it works fine?" "Yep," Henry said. "It was just different stuff." "But you can see Dr. Blanchard take it from the vats." "I know, but it's not the same stuff." "Why did Dr. Blanchard test it alone on a Sunday?" Ezra interjected. 2112 was Aurelie's baby, is Aurelie's baby," Henry answered. "I guess she wanted to be extra sure before this week." Ezra thought a moment in silence, staring at the floor, and then announced, "I'm done here. Can we go out the back?" "Okay," Henry said. The back hallway was as he had described, and after 2 locked doors we were in the loading area, tanks and crates and pallets of materials, within a small warehouse with a couple of roll-up doors. We walked to the only exterior man door and stepped out into the sudden bright sun. The Texas heat immediately blasted me, and I wanted to duck back inside, but Ezra stood there looking about. The docks were off to our right, but just to the left was a little shrubbery, and then the corner of the building beyond. Ezra looked up at the camera on the corner. "I do not think it's related," Henry said. "But I heard that camera's not actually working. Went out last week, and they had not fixed it over the weekend." "That's weird," I said, thinking, how could that be a coincidence, and also wondering why James hadn't said anything about a broken camera. Ezra eyed the camera, and then the area. He turned to the shrubbery, and peering behind the nearest bush, he said, "Well, here are 2 marks in the gravel. Pretty good divots." "What?" Henry and I both said as we stooped to look. Indeed, there in the otherwise smooth gravel were 2 small divots. "Maybe someone knelt there," I suggested. "Maybe hiding, waiting to get in through the door after someone came out." Ezra didn't respond, but peered down the remaining length of the shrubbery. He was not long at this when he turned and said, "Okay, I'm done." I was astounded. "What about the mark?" I pressed. He shrugged. "I've seen it. What else can I do?" Part 4. 15 minutes later, we were in the car again, headed to the home of Dr. Blanchard. "Any thoughts?" I asked Ezra. "I'm very suspicious," he said flatly. "Suspicious?" I repeated. "I'm not sure what you're suspicious about, but the whole thing is absolutely bizarre. One moment it seems so straightforward. It was just an accident. There was a mistake. The new chemicals, designed by simulations and algorithms, are unstable and a scientist gets burned. But the next instant I'm told that's impossible, and instead there's an unlocked door, marks in the gravel, a random guy in the building, and a suspicious recruiter from a competitor trying to buy off the staff. There is a lot of noise," Ezra responded dryly. "And a department head, with too much to do to give us any attention, and an absent security team," I added to my list. He did not respond, but looked out of the tinted window at the Texas sun. The facility was well outside the dense metropolitan sprawl of Houston and on the verge of rural open land. We were passing by expansive properties with luxury homes set well back from the road within meticulously manicured grounds, and with gated black asphalt drives with stone pillars upon either side of the entry. After some 20 minutes or so, there were fewer of these large homes, however, and the buildings were closer together. Suddenly we were in a suburb, and then passing by shops and grocery stores. A few turns later, and then we were pulling into the parking lot of an apartment building. Black and white, showing its age but well kept. Nothing great, nothing terrible. We had been told Dr. Blanchard's apartment number, so braving the southern sun, we walked along the path and into the foyer. No doorman. There were several people waiting for the elevator. She was on the 3rd floor, so we took the stairs. As we walked up, I told Ezra, "Don't bring up her burn. I'm sure she's very self-conscious about it." "You think me so imperceptive of human emotion," he said in response. "You do know you're human too, right?" I said. "Because you say stuff like that, and it sounds like you are talking about a different species." A long walk down a dull hallway brought us to the scientist's door. I knocked, and we waited what seemed like a long time. At last I heard steps, and then locks, and then Dr. Blanchard finally opened the door. I was shocked, but not at how bad she looked, but rather how good. There was a gleam on her face of an ointment or cream, and it was red, but I've seen worse sunburns. In fact, most of the burn radiated from the right cheek, but her left forehead and chin were nearly untouched. "Hello," she said, her tone bearing an undeniable depression. "Hello," I answered. "I'm John Spencer. This is Ezra Lockwood. We were told you could speak with us a moment." "Yeah, that's fine," she said, her expression and manner saying the complete opposite, and waved us in. The apartment, like the rest of the building, was dated and unassuming, but the impression was more acute here, for the space was meant to be a home, with its own personality and individual touch. But instead it was the building still which you saw, the drab bare walls, the bland tile and wood floor. There were very little personal belongings or furniture in sight. The place was sparse and empty, and at the same time untidy except for the kitchen. The kitchen was in perfect order, with freshly washed glass containers still out to dry. The smell of cleaners lingered in the air, so I had the sense she had been trying to tidy up, but intrusive company kept interrupting her. I remembered James saying the team had been working long hours and thought this might be the first time Dr. Blanchard had really had time to think about her home. She waved us to the only chairs in the place, a couple of mismatched plastic things about a chintzy little table, and said, "I've already told the police and Cyrus everything. I don't understand who you guys are, and what more you hope to find out." She was frustrated, yes, but also depressed. I wondered if it was shock or disappointment. I recall vividly my own sense of sadness just being around her. She was the opposite of Henry. She pulled you down. The place pulled you down. She was young, intelligent, leading the way in her field and very attractive, and yet she and her home felt empty, forgotten, stagnant. I wondered where the man was from the photo on her desk. She sat down opposite us and looked blankly out the drab window, which showed only another building. Ezra was saying nothing, so I, in a fumbling way, asked how she was doing. "Fine," she answered without emotion. "I understand you were released from the hospital just this morning?" I asked lamely. "Yes, between the drawn-out release at the hospital and visits from Dr. Vishwakarma and Cyrus and the police, I've hardly had a moment to myself." "I'm sorry, Dr. Blanchard," I said guiltily. I'm sure you don't like going over this and would just like to move on. It seems someone from a competitor has been asking around. Did he try to speak with you?" "Yes," she said, still looking out the window. I didn't know how to ask the logical next question, so I dithered a moment, but she guessed my thought and said irritably, "No, I didn't take him up on his offer." "To recruit you?" "Yes." "Do you suspect he was involved in the accident?" "Possibly." "Do you know how to reach him, a number or location?" "No." "Did you ever see anyone in or near or around the lab or the facility who seemed out of place or suspicious?" Her lack of interaction had flustered me, and I was stumbling over my words as I tried to form a coherent question. All the while, Ezra sat quietly and unhelpfully to my left, looking idly about. "Not really. There can be people there I don't know any given day, of course. But nothing really sticks out. I've heard there was a guy on the surveillance, though." I appreciated that she gave me a bit of a response, and I hoped she was easing up. But then I realized I had nothing else to ask. I didn't expect this to be my interview, and as I had told Henry, I was just along for the ride. After an awkward several moments, I asked Ezra if he had anything he wanted to ask Dr. Blanchard. He stirred as if he had been daydreaming, and I marveled at his inability to focus as we wasted this unfortunate woman's time going over the same things she had already reviewed with the legitimate investigators. I felt we were imposters, unnecessary, and now Ezra was being tiresome and impolite as well. "Oh, nothing really comes to mind," he said thoughtlessly. I barely restrained an outburst against him, and the doctor's face showed her contempt clearly. But, before anything could be said, Ezra added, "Well, maybe one thing." Finally, I thought, his great skill will at last reveal itself, and we will be able to help this woman. She looked at him, her green eyes narrow and sullen. "Are you a great fan of diving?" he said. I was shocked. Dr. Blanchard was confused, her eyes going suddenly wide. "Scuba, snorkeling," he clarified to her baffled face. "You know, that kind of thing." She stammered, Yes, I enjoy free diving and snorkeling very much." "Ah," he said as if that information actually somehow mattered. "And do you go often to the sea to snorkel?" "Yes, as much as my schedule allows." "But it's difficult, as you prefer South American waters?" "Yes," she said, a wistful look coming upon her face, a hint of life or at least a memory of life. Florida and Mexico are okay, she said. But Brazil, Honduras, Nicaragua are beautiful. Fernando de Noronha is just a paradise for freediving. For but a moment her eyes were glistening with joy, but then the light was turned off again and she sank once more. Her voice dull, she said, "We used to go somewhere at least twice a year." I didn't understand the reason for Ezra's questioning, but she was beginning to loosen up, it seemed. I thought he was intentionally bringing her out of her shock with something she loved. "And what will you do now?" Ezra asked. She seemed confused again. "Well, now that you and your husband have divorced," Ezra explained. I could not believe his behavior. "Ezra," I said angrily, "that's rude and none of your business. You don't even know if she has been divorced or was even married." Ezra raised his eyebrows and said, "I do know both, actually. Dr. Aurelie Blanchard, née Hardin, was married to Keith Blanchard for 7 years. Mr. Blanchard is a very wealthy developer with investment properties throughout the Caribbean and South American mainland, places where he and Dr. Blanchard would frequent on their snorkeling and diving adventures. That's what I know. What I'm wondering is, now that the wealthy husband will no longer be paying for such trips, and the doctor here, who suffers from extreme aerophobia, would have to take a plane rather than his luxury company yacht, what her plans are for continuing her water-related hobbies in South America." I watched the fury build in her wounded face, and her fist clenched so that her fingers became white and her hand shook. But within a few seconds, and with what I believed was absolutely amazing control, she mastered herself and took in a deep breath, and letting it out said, "There are plenty of places to enjoy the water in the States. I can make do." I was very impressed with her self-mastery, and said, "I'm so sorry for Ezra. He sometimes doesn't care about other people's feelings. I'm sorry to hear about your divorce." The air seemed to thrum with suppressed energy, and so I tried again. "It looks like your wounds are healing very nicely. From the recording, honestly, I expected them to look much worse." I kicked myself inwardly at having broken my own rule for Ezra in my fluster. Still simmering, she said, "Yes, I applied lotion only minutes before. The doctor said it lessened the burn significantly." "Well," I said, "I'm sorry to have brought it up. I told myself I wouldn't." I gave a self-deprecating laugh and derided myself inwardly once more. "We should be leaving," I suggested, rising from my seat. "Come, Ezra. I'm sorry to have bothered you needlessly, Dr. Blanchard." "Well, that was an embarrassing waste of time," I fumed at Ezra as we walked to the car. "I think it was very edifying." He countered without reaction. "How?" I asked, frustrated. "How is it edifying to the accident we were sent here to investigate, to know that the wounded doctor can't snorkel anymore?" "I didn't say that part was edifying," he answered. "I found it interesting the false nails upon her second and third finger of her left hand were newer than the rest." Disbelief didn't quite seem like a strong enough word for what I felt in that instant. "You harassed that woman just to walk away pleased that you had noticed she had broken a couple of nails and replaced them? You do recall she was in an accident yesterday, don't you?" "Ah, John," he replied placidly, "if I treated you with the same hostility at your little observances, you would find me utterly unbearable." Nothing more of that conversation need be related, for it was neither profitable nor pleasant to anyone involved. And for my part, I much regret it, and can only say Ezra is a greater man than many could believe. For he is never one to say "I told you so," though he has been given so many fine opportunities. Nonetheless, eventually we decided to have lunch. It was well into the afternoon now, and we were certainly ready for a meal and a distraction. We ate at a little sandwich place. The food was good, and for some minutes it alone filled my thoughts. Yet as I set my napkin down, I found my mind circling back to the recruiter, or rather, as James termed him, the poacher, from the competitor. and I voiced this rumination, saying with some exasperation, "If only we could find that guy." "Which guy?" Ezra asked. "The recruiter everyone keeps talking about." "Why?" Ezra responded blandly. I was befuddled. "To see what he knows, of course." "Who cares what he knows? He wasn't in the lab. He doesn't really matter." "How do you know he wasn't in the lab?" Ezra looked at me questioningly now. "You saw the recording," he said. "There was no one else there, and this Cyrus Anders and the others in the security department have watched everything, from last Friday to the incident yesterday." "But the recording can be manipulated," I answered with certainty. "Can be cut, patched, whatever." "That seems highly unlikely. Their security is rigorous. The data is stored locally. You saw the servers." "Oh, the data monitored by this Cyrus guy, who, like Dr. Vishwakarma, doesn't seem to have the time to meet with us? Come on," I said with disbelief. "Oh," he said with interest. "So you formed an answer to this little problem, have you, John? An extensive, deep conspiracy." "Well," I hesitated, "I don't know about conspiracy, but if a competitor is willing to put the money behind it, it surely could be done. This recruiter talked to everyone, right? Including Dr. Vishwakarma and Cyrus as well. It's the weekend. Almost no one is there. All Dr. Vishwakarma and Cyrus would have to do is to go into the lab, mess with the flasks or the sample or whatever, and then splice the recording of a blank room so that it looks like they were never there." "Ah," he said. "Remember, though, it's not just the cameras in the lab, John. It's every camera for every hallway, throughout the whole walk from the entry. I don't know about you, but I happen to count them. Do you know how many cameras that is, John?" "I do. 24. I admitted with a disappointed sigh. I had not realized there had been so many cameras, but still I pressed. "That doesn't make it impossible. It would just take longer." "Okay," Ezra went on. "So you're saying Dr. Vishwakarma and Cyrus came in and never passed another person they knew, found easy splicing points where no one was in the shot but them, and after sabotaging the lab, made their way to the security room, again without passing anyone, without sharing a single camera shot with another soul, and then spent hours cleaning up the additional 32 cameras for that trek?" I was shocked again at the additional number of cameras, but undaunted said, "Well, if they worked at night, it could easily be done. No one else to be on the camera, plenty of time to clean up the footage." "Ah," Ezra said again. "How about this instead? Why come in the front and pass by all those cameras? Remember the back door, John, the mark in the gravel. How about instead they simply come in the back? They first slink around the corner of the building, put a ladder in the gravel and disable the camera. That gives us our divots in the shrubbery. They enter the back door, and by careful planning, they can walk the whole way and be in sight of only 2 functioning cameras, aside from the 3 in the lab and the 1 in the office. In fact, maybe not even both men enter the lab, but just Dr. Vishwakarma. While he sneaks into the lab, Mr. Anders, who has chosen to be a very kind boss, tells the rest of the security team he will take the graveyard shift alone and sends them all home. He manages the cameras in real time as Dr. Vishwakarma does his dastardly work." "Yes," I exclaimed. "Precisely, that's it." He smiled in a conciliatory way, as though he were dealing with a simple child, and said, "The problem, John, with looking very closely for something is that you often find something." Perplexed, I took the bait. "What does that mean?" "We went searching for clues," he answered, "and we found many. But to assume every clue we find is relevant to our little problem of the exploding sample is to fall into a very common trap. It's an information bias, an observer bias." "What do you mean?" I persisted. "I mean, if one is looking for things, one will see things, especially if one really wants to see things. but you must have the objectivity to filter out the irrelevant from the relevant. If I told you, John, an intruder had been in our apartment, you could walk in there right now, and by studying the place closely and looking at things in a way which you never look at them, you could concoct a whole story about how this intruder gained entry, what they did while in the apartment, and so on. You would say, I know I didn't leave that door ajar. What is this curious dirt on the rug? This isn't my hair. Who moved my wallet? And so on. Things, circumstances, which are there all of the time, suddenly take on a whole new meaning. It's the preconditioning, the setting up the observer to expect. To expect? Yes, to expect and to suspect. And you haven't done that, I understand. You have been absolutely and completely unbiased? No thought occurred to you when you saw the marks in the gravel? Nothing today has made you concoct a possible explanation, or at least form a line of questioning, aside from, I wonder if the burned doctor will be able to snorkel still now that her husband has left her? I did not hide my frustration, yet he only laughed, which I am sure you can understand how infuriating that was. I understand it is not fair, maybe, he said. But yes, I have remained unbiased, because that is my natural way. I do not immediately believe what I am told, because people lie. People misremember. People are flippant about their stories. I do not immediately form imaginary connections between two disparate things, because the world is a chaos of disparate things which are not connected. It is this impulse to see patterns in the disconnected that is not active in me. Life is not a pattern. Life is not a concise narrative of events that tie together and progress forward in a clean and orderly way. That's not life, John. That's fiction. You're so cynical, I said. I don't believe that. Besides, what's your point? My point is we don't have enough facts to be going about concocting elaborate stories of duplicitous doctors and suspicious security guards. Information, John, is what we need. I chuckled at his alliteration and said, Fine, information. What information would you like, Ezra? Two things, he said smilingly. I want to know about waste management schedules and the love lives of algorithm-writing chemists. I hope you will understand my bewilderment at these two things, which ranked so high on Ezra's list, and thus will agree with me when I responded, That's absurd. What about the recruiter? In that moment, however, Ezra received a message. After reading it, he chuckled wryly and then said, Well, it seems your heart's desire has been granted. Cyrus has located this recruiter. Here is the address, John. But they have called the authorities, and it is unclear where he will be questioned and by whom. We have to get over there right away then. Come on, I said, jumping up and fully expecting him to do the same. But he remained sitting passively. No, he said. That's a waste of time. What? I demanded. I already told you he wasn't there. Ezra explained placidly. I'm not denying he may be at the back of it all, but he is not at the front, so I'm not interested in him. Let the others get his story. No way, I said firmly. I'm going there right now to hear for myself before the police drag the whole thing out with their snail-paced bureaucracy. Suit yourself, he said. I'll get another car. Flabbergasted, yet determined to prove him wrong, I left him, saying, Fine, I will see you later at the hotel. So it was. I left him calmly sitting there, looking infuriatingly smug, I thought, while I rushed off to the address he had given me. How I should have listened to him. I would like to say that now that I have had more experience with Ezra, I would believe him in future similar scenarios, and would listen to his advice. But I know that is not true. I am an impulsive and active man, and more likely to think after the deed than before. As my reward for this compulsion, I spent several hours that afternoon trying to get into rooms, situations, and even police stations where I was persistently rejected and given absolutely no information. At the address where Cyrus had spoken to the recruiter, the situation had become heated. By the time I had arrived, it wasn't clear who the police were supposed to be coming for, Cyrus or the recruiter. In the end, both parties were asked to the station to make their separate statements, and I had to follow along as best I could. It was all to no benefit, however, and in the end, after grabbing a quick meal, I slunk to our hotel room around 9 in the evening. Ezra had not checked in, and I waited restlessly for him for hours. I did not want to send a message and admit my failure, but I did desperately want to know if he had been more successful than I had. Instead, alone and uninformed, I eventually fell asleep around 11. Thank you for listening to the Atlantia Mysteries. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and consider sharing it with a friend and rate and review it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more and to connect with this project, you can find us on most social platforms by searching for the Atlantia Mysteries and on our website www.theatlantiamysteries.com. For information, suggestions, promotion, and reproduction, please send an email directly to hello@theatlantiamysteries.com.